Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in for Unit 3 in our course here. I'm just going to pop myself into our due dates. So we've just passed Unit 2, actually a few days ago, but with the long weekend, which was good for everybody, I hope. Should have started by saying that. And I should just do this whole thing again, but I'm not going to, so there you go. I'm also wearing gym shorts right now. Just laying it all out there right off the bat. Anyway, great work on the Milton unit and Paradise Lost. People wrote some really good essays and responses to essays as well that pursued some of the individual themes in a work that just has so much going on. What you probably found was that you were had too much to say rather than too little, and we're having to choose among many details. And really that one of the great aspects of Paradise Lost is how themes don't just exist on their own in that work, but exist relationally to others. So for example, love and obedience or disobedience are deeply connected. Themes of free will and choice, or obedience leads us to questions of free will and choice. So it's actually hard to pick among the many examples for any individual theme, but then to try to isolate an individual theme and where it occurs, because Milton has done such an amazing job of weaving these very big themes across so many different kinds of landscapes that are divine, that are heroic, that are very human all at once. So it is, like I said before a number of times, it's really epic in every possible way in terms of its bigness, its attention to detail, which makes it obviously very difficult to write about. But there were some really good essays. And like I said, lots of really thoughtful responses to essays, which are really equally important, to be perfectly honest. Maybe not for the individual work that you as an individual are doing in the course, but certainly for the sense of a group dynamic that discussion kind of format is meant to facilitate. So anyway, really good work with Milton, and he sets the groundwork and again some of those major themes of free will, free choice, that set of themes, their relationship to obedience, disobedience, that really sets the groundwork for where we're at now, getting into the Romantic period, which begins about the 1800 mark, which is where our course is supposed to begin. Although one of the things that I mentioned in the unit itself is that these kind of delineations are really in many cases just academically useful for us. Like the Romantics never called themselves the Romantics. There was the Lake School of Poets, for example, that included Coleridge and Wordsworth and a number of other writers, but they never referred to themselves as Romantics or noted that their era began on a certain date and would likely end on a certain date forthcoming. We better get all our work done before we move on to the Victorian period. So it's important to keep in mind that these things are really academic fictions that are useful for grouping writers that have similar tendencies, but you can easily find Romantic era writers who embrace Enlightenment belief in the power of reason over imagination, where prototypical Romantics will privilege imagination over reason, as if those two can be mutually exclusive somehow. You'll find what would become Victorian era concerns about kind of the domestic sphere as a major part of Romantic era authors like Austen and those kinds of people. So again, there's lots of exceptions to the rule. The author that we're looking at for Unit 3, Thomas Gray, in his interesting poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, is kind of old-timey by Romantic standards. It is, formal in a lot of ways, and its syntax is a little bit more like Milton than like later Romantics who are interested in a more conversational approach. But Gray, as a kind of pre-Romantic, is really important because he addresses in this particular poem one of the aspects or one of the themes that would become so important for Romantic era authors is the relationship between the high or the noble, the mighty, quote unquote, the historically important, and the low, the unnamed, the uneducated. So romantics, especially like Wordsworth, would be really interested in those kind of marginal aspects of society that up until that point really had not been treated seriously by poets. In fact, one of the rules of so-called decorum in poetry as part of the Enlightenment period was really that the attention to the poor, the sick, those marginal figures, the uneducated, that really wasn't fit material for poetry, and if they showed up at all, they were these sort of buffoonish stock characters. The poor, uneducated character was always great fodder for, comic relief, but could never really be taken seriously. Wordsworth and others mark a really dramatic shift in terms of the seriousness with which they treat those previously marginalized kind of subjects. And so we see that impulse coming through in Gray, and it becomes a really interesting poem precisely because of how he sort of consciously or unconsciously or intentionally or not quite positions himself relative to the poor, the uneducated, the high and mighty, the named and the privileged. Where does the poet himself fall within that kind of continuum? So even though Gray is not maybe a romantic figure in the obvious ways that people like Coleridge and Wordsworth will be once we get to them, again, Gray really lays out and approaches or explores one of the themes that will become so important during the Romantic period. So Romanticism itself is covered fairly well, I think, in the unit. I won't really go into that too much. Notice how short it is, about 1798, 1788, depending on what source you look at, until about 1832 or 1837. So 30 years maybe, a very short time. And note that someone like Wordsworth, again, this prototypical romantic, he's born obviously and is writing well before the so-called beginning of the Romantic period and lives well past it. So his writing life is contained, by the Romantic period, but there's pieces on either end of it. So even then you see how kind of artificial that those dating mechanisms are. They're just useful for us in terms of seeing very general and overall patterns and really relationships between very broad groups of writers. So the Romantic period shows an interest in those marginal subjects. It tries to privilege imagination and kind of the organic creation of things rather than this emphasis on reason and the power of reason, which is something we'd seen in Milton. The power of free choice is ultimately for Milton the power of reason. So he believed in basic issues of free speech and free press. Whereas the press was highly censored at the time. Everything had to go through kind of official government endorsement before it could be publicly circulated, officially anyway. Milton argued that everything should be available if people can find the means to make it public, but that the reading public's ability to reason would distinguish good from bad ideas in the marketplace of possibilities, if you want to think of it that way. Now, clearly, if you've ever flipped the channels on your TV, you know that theory doesn't seem to have played out. Right reason and reality television don't really go together, but it's a nice theory that our ability to decide will lead us to the best that hath been thought and said, which is what a later writer will cover, Matthew Arnold, would ultimately say. So anyway, we have this period in Milton and the Enlightenment thinkers of this real emphasis on reason, and that's the primary capacity that will allow us to think the best thoughts. And I think because of a number of things, not least of which is this sort of revolutionary impulse to think beyond the structures that we're familiar with, like the American and the French revolutions are perfect examples. They really led to this reevaluation of the capacity for reason, kind of its limits, honestly, in the Romantic period, and so a privileging more of imagination. And those two were kind of played off of each other, even though, again, the more you think about it, the less purely separate they really are. The assignment for this week is a little bit different than the discussion board essay that we've done for Unit 2, although we will get back to more of that discussion board essay style, partly because there's sort of two different ways that I want you to approach grade. Partly, and this is why we have both a short answer and then a longer answer section rather than just a single essay, partly there's just some comprehension issues that I want to make sure that people have in place, and so that's something that the short answer format is much better for, like, did you get this, how would you reword this idea or line, and kind of more specific questions like that. And then the long answer, without having to write an entire essay as well, lets us get at some of the larger issues. We also, for the first time, look at this little tool that I've really grown to love, is Wordle. Again, it's explained in the unit, but it's this statistical analysis tool, which makes it sound very fancy, and I sound very smart when I say that, to myself at least. But basically, it allows you to plug in any text, and then it feeds back this visual picture where words that occur more frequently are bigger, and words that are less frequent are smaller, relatively speaking. So it's funny, and sometimes it confirms what we already know about a piece of writing where a theme that's really obvious will pop out as this large word. But in other cases, like this Wordle of Gray's elegy, we get some words that pop out that maybe aren't as obvious when we're reading the poem in a conventional way, but really point us to some themes that are really prominent, but that we didn't necessarily get a hold of the first time we read it. So I point to a couple of these, and you can look at it and offer your own analysis or make your own judgment about whether this confirms what you thought or whether there's some elements here that were a little bit surprising in terms of frequently occurring words. Yeah, and there's a challenge here that if you want to try to cut and paste the entirety of Paradise Lost, see what you get, that would be very cool. Definitely post the results or email me, and I'll post them up in our class here for other people to see. I've tried it a couple times and my computer crashes every time, so I'll leave that to braver souls out there. Okay, so as always, if you have any questions or concerns or comments or anything going on, let me know. Hopefully you're enjoying our fairly intimate class setting here. It actually is kind of cool. This would be really ideal if we were face-to-face, but if you've read some of the student home pages, that would be a hell of a commute for some people. So here we are online with our cozy little class. Again, be in touch with any questions or comments, and I'll talk to everybody soon.